Hello, fellow night owl. As the world softens and the day draws to a close, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. Whether you're listening in the hush of early morning, the warmth of the afternoon, or the quiet hours of night, it means a great deal to have you here. You're part of a thoughtful, reflective community, and I'm grateful for your presence. Before we step gently into another chapter of our journey through medieval womanhood, would you mind sharing where you've been retuning in from and what time it is for you right now? I love seeing all the corners of the world light up with curiosity and connection. And if these gentle explorations of history help you unwind or feel a little less alone, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. It truly helps this space grow and keeps these forgotten voices alive. So settle in, get cozy, dim the lights, let your shoulders drop, take a deep breath, and let's take another step back into time. Together, we begin a gentle but eye-opening journey into the lives of women during the medieval era, spanning roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th. This period was one of castles and cathedrals, knights and plagues, revolutions and stagnation. But beyond the myths and metal armor, there existed a quieter, often harsher reality, especially for women. While our minds might conjure images of courtly love, princesses in towers, or nuns cloistered in candlelit abbeys, the truth was rarely so romantic. For most women, life in medieval Europe was one of relentless labor, limited rights, and constant vulnerability. From the moment she took her first breath, a medieval girl's fate was largely decided. She was born into a rigid social structure where men held nearly all power: political, legal, religious, and domestic. First, she belonged to her father, then to her husband. Autonomy was a luxury very few women could dream of, let alone attain. But not all medieval women lived the same life. A peasant girl and a noblewoman, a merchant's daughter and a queen, might experience drastically different daily routines and burdens. Yet across all classes, women shared common restrictions and expectations that defined their existence: obedience, chastity, hard work, silence. In the coming episodes, we'll walk slowly and softly through the stages of a medieval woman's life, from her earliest days to the long shadows of old age. We'll explore not just the facts of their existence, but the emotions, the fears, the rare joys, and the quiet strength that helped them endure. We'll hear stories of queens and commoners, healers and heretics, wives, widows, and mystics. Through them, we'll witness a more nuanced, more human portrait of the Middle Ages, one far removed from the fairy tales we grew up with. But before we dive into the chronology of girlhood to grandmotherhood, let's pause to set the scene. Imagine, if you will, a world lit only by fire, a world where the day begins not with alarms, but with the sun rising over misty fields, where work is backbreaking and endless, and rest is a rare indulgence. Picture the silhouettes of stone castles against the dawn, the rough thatch of peasant homes clustered near a manor, smoke rising gently from cooking fires. The distant toll of bells marks the hours, calling monks to prayer and signaling the passage of time. The smell of wet earth, wool, and wood smoke fills the air. In this world, survival is a daily task, not a guarantee. And into this world, a girl is born. From the very beginning, her presence is practical. She is expected to help, to obey, to make herself useful. Toys and leisure are fleeting, if they exist at all. Her path is already marked, first to serve her family, then to marry and serve another. Her world is not large. It stretches only as far as her village, her parish, or the walls of her home. But within that confined space, she learns the rhythms of a medieval life, the seasons, the prayers, the customs passed down from mother to daughter like worn tools. She learns how to spin wool, bake coarse bread, patch clothes, and fetch water from the stream, all under the watchful eye of the women around her. She grows up hearing stories of saints and sinners, of martyrs and miracle workers. She learns to fear God, to revere the Virgin Mary, to believe that suffering is a virtue. She also learns silence. In public, her voice carries little weight. Her opinions matter less than her obedience. Her safety depends on her reputation. As night falls in our story, we also reflect. The past isn't just a list of events and names. It is a mirror that shows us where we've been and how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. We often forget that women like her lived whole lives, lives full of thought, feeling, and struggle, even if their names didn't make it into the history books. So tonight, as you drift into dreams, hold space for these forgotten girls, these silent women who endured so much with so little. The flicker of their lives, like candlelight in the dark, still warms the world if we remember to notice. In the next episode, we'll look more closely at the fragile years of girlhood, how a child became a woman in a world that rarely gave her time to simply be a child. Until then, rest well. You are safe, you are seen, and you are part of a long and resilient lineage of listeners who care about the quiet voices of history. The medieval girl came into the world already stitched into a tapestry not of her choosing. From the first breath, she drew in a smoke-scented cottage or stone manor hall. Her place in society was predetermined. Her path would not be carved through ambition, desire, or learning, but through obedience, sacrifice, and quiet labor. Childhood in the Middle Ages was a fleeting thing, especially for girls. The concept of a long, protected period of youth was foreign. There was no notion of adolescence, no room for exploration, no luxury of self-discovery. A child who could walk and speak could also fetch water, sweep the floor, or tend the younger children. Play was a privilege, not a right. And for the average medieval girl, even play came with rules. Her dolls, if she had any, were likely handmade, from scraps of cloth or carved wood. She might mimic her mother churning butter or her sister stitching a hem. These moments of pretend were not rehearsal for fantasy, but training for reality. Her games were shadowed by expectation. By age 5 or 6, her days were shaped by service. Her tasks might seem small at first: feeding chickens, gathering herbs, watching the fire. But soon they grew heavier. Helping with laundry meant scrubbing coarse linen in icy water. Fetching water meant hauling heavy buckets across uneven ground. She learned quickly that pain was part of duty, and that a girl's strength was measured in how quietly she endured it. Her education was not marked by books or classrooms. It took place in kitchens and courtyards, beside the hearth and beneath the trees. She was taught by example, by watching the women in her life survive. Reading and writing were reserved for boys, or perhaps for the daughters of nobles who might become nuns. Most peasant girls never saw a manuscript, let alone read one. But that did not mean they lacked intelligence. A medieval girl absorbed a wealth of knowledge. She learned the rhythms of the seasons, the timing of crops, the uses of dozens of herbs. She learned to knead bread without scales, to sew without patterns, to soothe a fever with willow bark. Her skills were invisible, unrecorded, and essential. Religion seeped into her mind from the start. The church offered the rules that governed her world. She was taught that Eve's disobedience brought sin into the world, and that Mary's purity redeemed it. These two poles, sinful and sacred, were the choices presented to her. Be like Mary, be quiet, be clean, be good. And yet, for all this guidance, little protection was offered. Many girls did not survive childhood. Illness, accidents, malnutrition, and neglect took countless young lives. If a girl made it to her 12th birthday, she was considered ready for marriage. Her childhood, such as it was, ended. Even noble girls, wrapped in finer linens and fed from better kitchens, were not spared this rush toward adulthood. Their futures were decided in treaties and dowries, their value calculated in land and alliance. A noble girl might be promised in marriage before she even understood what the word meant. Her beauty was weighed, her fertility assumed. In this world, a girl's body was not truly her own. It belonged first to her family, then to the man they chose. Her worth was her womb. Her voice, unless exceptionally lucky or well-born, was a whisper no one asked to hear. Still, within these narrow confines, girls found ways to be themselves. They giggled behind doorways, whispered secrets to one another, and carved initials into wooden beams. They plucked flowers and sang hymns and dreamed small dreams. In the margins of their lives, they found joy and sometimes resistance. A girl might drag her feet a little longer before coming inside. She might pretend not to hear when called. She might watch the horizon and wonder if there was more. Such moments were fleeting, but real. These girls were not just obedient vessels. They were people, curious, resilient, clever. Their lives laid the foundation for everything that came after. The skills they learned, the burdens they bore, the stories they heard, all of it was preparation, not for greatness perhaps, but for survival. As we leave this quiet corner of history tonight, think of her, not as a figure in a painting or a name in a scroll, but as a living child, her hands chapped from the cold, her knees dusty from the earth, her eyes still wide with wonder. She was there, and she mattered. In our next part, we'll explore the moment where girlhood ends and another role begins, the transition into marriage, what it meant to be given away, what was expected of a wife, and what realities awaited in the arms of a stranger. Until then, may your sleep be peaceful, and your dreams filled with the strength and spirit of those forgotten girls who once watched the same moonlight through their tiny, shuttered windows. In the medieval world, the end of girlhood did not arrive gently. It came with a suddenness that today might feel like a loss, a disappearance. One day, a girl might still be whispering to her sisters or helping her mother knead dough, and the next, she would find herself draped in a veil, exchanged like a parcel, spoken for, but seldom spoken to. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a celebration of love. It was a contract, an economic and social strategy, often sealed long before the bride reached maturity. For many girls, particularly among the nobility, engagements were arranged when they were barely out of the cradle. A girl might be betrothed at 7 and wed by 12, her body still growing. Her voice barely settled into its adult register. The legal minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But legality was no guarantee of readiness. The church, while enforcing these minimums, rarely intervened when younger unions were proposed. A girl's consent, in theory required, could be whispered under pressure or assumed altogether. What mattered most was the alignment of wealth, power, and lineage. In noble families, marriage was often diplomacy cloaked in lace and linen. Lands were united, treaties secured, alliances cemented through the exchange of daughters. Dowries flowed like rivers, cattle, silver, tracts of land, all meant to sweeten the deal and elevate the family's status, and the bride, silent and smiling, was expected to be the perfect vessel of transition. But not only nobles traded their daughters. Peasant families, though less entangled in politics, still arranged marriages to secure labor, merge farms, or relieve financial burdens. A girl's marriage could mean one less mouth to feed or an extra pair of hands for the in-laws' fields. Emotion played little role. Imagine a girl, maybe 13 or 14, summoned one evening and told she will be married by the next full moon. The man might be twice her age. He might be a stranger. She will leave the home she's known, move into a new family, and assume the duties of a wife before she fully understands what that means. She learns quickly. A wife in medieval Europe was expected to obey, to serve, and, most importantly, to bear children. Her body became a cradle for future generations. Her fertility was her value. Wedding ceremonies varied by class and region, but they shared one element: finality. Once vows were spoken, a girl became a woman in the eyes of her community, regardless of her feelings or fears. A peasant wedding might be a humble affair. A priest, a few witnesses, a shared cup of ale. A noble wedding could last days, filled with feasting, music, and displays of wealth. But the bride's role was largely the same in both: ceremonial, passive, ornamental. Some girls found happiness, or at least companionship, in their arranged matches. Many others did not. There was little recourse for an unhappy wife. Divorce was nearly unheard of. Separation required church approval and could be granted only in extreme cases, usually for reasons of consanguinity or impotence, not abuse or unhappiness. And the shift in power was stark. A girl went from being under her father's roof to her husband's dominion. Her voice, her opinions, even her body, now belonged to another. Marital rape was not a concept recognized by law. A husband had a legal and moral right to his wife's submission, and any resistance could be punished physically, emotionally, or socially. Women who failed to conceive were often blamed and shamed, though fertility challenges were poorly understood. A barren wife might be set aside, replaced, or punished. The pressure to produce a male heir loomed large, particularly for noble women. For queens, the stakes were even higher. Generations of dynastic succession hung on the success of their wombs. Yet within these rigid structures, some women carved out influence. A mother who bore sons gained status. A wife who managed her household wisely earned quiet respect. A clever woman might learn to guide her husband's decisions or mediate family disputes. Power, for a medieval wife, was often indirect, but not absent. There were, of course, exceptions. Historical records mention women who resisted, escaped, or refused marriages. There were instances of elopement, of convents as refuge, even of legal challenges. But these were rare and fraught with danger. One poignant example is Isabeau of Bavaria, married to King Charles VI of France at age 15. Her youth was no shield against the overwhelming burden placed upon her. Her husband, prone to fits of madness, left her to manage the kingdom during his episodes. Still practically a girl, she became regent, diplomat, and queen in all but name. She bore many children, suffered public scrutiny, and held power in a world that rarely welcomed female authority. Her story is not romantic, it is resilient. In every village and court, thousands of stories unfolded like Isabeau's, though most were never written down. Most girls, now wives, learned to keep their heads down, their hands busy, and their hearts quiet. They became mistresses of hearth and home, managers of meals, and menders of cloth, carriers of family honor, and keepers of tradition. As we close this chapter, let us not forget that behind every historical alliance, every family name passed through the centuries, there stood a girl turned wife, often invisible, often unheard, but central to the continuity of medieval life. In our next episode, we'll step into the most intimate and perilous chapter of medieval womanhood, motherhood, the expectations, the risks, the heartbreak, and the resilience of those who carried life in a world where death was never far. Until then, rest gently, and may the dreams that follow tonight be filled with peace, and not the weight of promises made without your voice. Motherhood in the medieval world was both a sacred duty and a perilous gamble. It was expected, celebrated, feared, and mourned. From the moment a young bride entered her husband's home, the clock began ticking. Her body, once a child's, now belonged to the rhythms of fertility, childbirth, and, too often, mourning. There was no question of if she would become a mother, only when. To be a wife was to be a mother in waiting. Pregnancy was the proof of a woman's value, a tangible sign of her obedience and divine favor. But even as her belly grew, so too did the risks. For medieval women, childbirth was not a joyful milestone. It was a dangerous crossing, and many never returned. Pregnancy care, such as it was, varied by social class. A noble woman might have access to midwives, herbal remedies, and advice passed through generations of noble matrons. She might be secluded, protected from stress, and fed a richer diet. But she was not safe. Wealth could not buy immunity from infection, hemorrhage, or complications. For the peasant woman, the risks were greater still. Malnutrition, hard labor, and lack of sanitation compounded the already grim odds. No matter her station, a woman entered labor knowing that death could be close at hand. It might come quickly, in a storm of blood and cries, or it might linger, cruel and slow, as fever took hold. There was no anesthesia, no antibiotics. Prayers were whispered, not just for life, but for a merciful death if things went wrong. Midwives were the guardians of these threshold moments. They held the trembling hands of women, listened to their screams, made poultices from herbs like mugwort and pennyroyal. They boiled linens, muttered charms, and tied belts of the Virgin Mary around swelling bellies. Their knowledge was practical, passed from hand to hand like a sacred trust, but it was also suspect. Accusations of witchcraft often followed those whose skills seemed too effective. For every successful birth, there were losses, stillbirths, babies who died within days, mothers who succumbed to childbed fever. And when the dust settled, if both mother and child survived, the true work of motherhood began: feeding, cleaning, clothing, teaching prayers, watching, always watching, for signs of sickness. In a world riddled with illness and famine, no child's survival was certain. Mothers lived with this constant ache, this half-swallowed fear. Some buried more children than they raised. And yet, amid the sorrow, there was tenderness. The lullabies sung softly at dusk, the care with which a swaddling cloth was folded, the way a mother stroked her child's hair with calloused hands. These moments, too, defined medieval motherhood. Not just endurance, but love. But that love was often constrained by pressure. Sons were desired, daughters tolerated. A woman who bore many sons gained status and security. One who bore only daughters might be pitied or scorned. Her worth was tied not only to her fertility, but to the gender of her children. It was a cruel arithmetic. For noble women, this pressure was political. Queens who failed to produce male heirs risked disgrace or divorce. The fate of dynasties rested on their wombs. Eleanor of Castile, wife to Edward III of England, endured 16 pregnancies over 28 years. She buried many of those children, and yet she remained at the center of royal life, a pillar of strength in a brutal system. Common women face fewer political pressures, but greater physical ones. With no rest from labor, either in fields or at home, their bodies bore the double burden of work and childbirth. Recovery was a luxury. A woman might give birth in the morning and be at the well by evening. Motherhood also carried legal and spiritual weight. The Church saw mothers as moral guides, responsible for shaping the souls of the next generation. But it also blamed them. If a child died unbaptized, the mother might be faulted. If a child grew wayward, her instruction was questioned. The medieval mother walked a tightrope of expectation, ever judged, rarely praised, and yet they endured. They told stories to soothe crying infants. They taught their children to pray. They passed down recipes, songs, and superstitions. Through them, culture survived. Some women resisted in small ways. A mother might secretly teach her daughter letters, might pass her a charm for safe childbirth, might whisper truths about survival. In doing so, she extended a lineage of resilience, not just of blood, but of knowledge. Let us remember that medieval motherhood was not a monolith. It was not always tragedy, nor was it always joy. It was both. It was pain and pride, loss and laughter, sacrifice and strength. When we speak of the past, we often name the kings, the battles, the buildings. But behind every one of those stories stands a woman who gave birth to it, quite literally. So tonight, as we draw the blanket close and let the world grow quiet, take a moment to honor the mothers who bore history at great cost and with great courage. In our next episode, we'll examine the day-to-day lives of medieval women. What filled the long hours between sunrise and sleep? What tools did they use? What knowledge did they guard? What did it mean to labor, not for glory, but for survival. Until then, sleep well and dream gently of those whose dreams were so often interrupted by the cry of a child in the dark. Daily life for a medieval woman was an unbroken chain of tasks, tethered to the rhythm of the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, and the needs of others. From the moment she stirred in the cold, gray dawn until her body gave out at nightfall, her existence was governed by duty. She labored not for wealth, recognition, or legacy, but for the bare continuance of life. For peasant women, the day began early, often before first light. She would rise from a straw-filled mattress in a damp, smoke-darkened room, perhaps shared with her children, her husband, even livestock, during the coldest months. Her first task? Stoke the fire. Without fire, there was no warmth, no food, no comfort. She fetched water, heavy freezing buckets, from a well or stream. Before breakfast, she baked bread using coarse, dark flour, then set about milking goats, feeding animals, or preparing porridge. Children clung to her skirts. The sick called from their beds. All this before the church bell rang for prime, the first prayer hour of the day. Her duties continued: cleaning, mending, weaving, spinning. If her family owned a small plot, she worked the fields beside her husband. She planted root vegetables, harvested grain, gathered herbs. If her husband had a trade, blacksmith, cobbler, cooper, she helped in his workshop. There was no such thing as women's work or men's work when survival was on the line. Everyone did everything. Domestic tasks never ceased. Laundry was a monumental chore. Clothes were soaked in lye or ash water, beaten on stones, scrubbed with harsh brushes, then dried near the fire, risking burns from flying embers. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Soap, if used at all, was made at home with tallow and lye. Rough on the skin, evenings were no reprieve. She prepared dinner, often a pottage of grains and root vegetables, occasionally enriched with eggs or salted pork. After eating, she might still be mending clothing, repairing tools, braiding cord, or grinding herbs by firelight. And when everyone else finally slept, she tended to the baby, or to a feverish child, or to her own sore feet, raw hands, and aching back. Her body bore the story of her labor: cracked heels, stooped shoulders, joints worn early. Most women had only a single pair of shoes, often patched beyond recognition. Their garments were homemade, reused, reshaped, passed down. Privacy was a luxury. Bathing was rare and communal, sometimes seasonal. In noble households, the rhythm was different, but not necessarily easier. A noblewoman might have servants, but she also carried the weight of managing an entire estate. She supervised the kitchens, the stores, the laundry, and the brewing of ale. She negotiated with tenants, handled correspondence, oversaw education. If her husband was away at war or court, she might act as de facto lord of the manor. But her days were filled too. Embroidery and spinning, yes, but also accounting, inventorying food supplies, managing servants. Her knowledge of herbal medicine often made her the healer of her household. And if illness or childbirth struck, she was expected to remain composed and capable. Both noble and common women kept gardens, grew herbs, tended animals. They knew how to preserve food, cure meat, make vinegar, distill oils, and dye fabrics. Their knowledge was practical, encyclopedic, passed from mother to daughter without books or formal schools. This labor was not simply physical, it was emotional. Women were the caretakers of the sick, the elderly, the young. They listened to complaints, settled disputes, absorbed anger, offered comfort. They were the unseen glue, holding households together. Leisure, such as it was, came in scraps. A moment to sit and spin wool while chatting with a neighbor. A stolen laugh during market day. A song hummed while stirring a pot. Church festivals and holy days offered brief respites. Times to gather, to sing, to feast. But even these were bound by expectations, modesty, decorum, piety. Women also worked beyond their homes. They brewed ale, sold eggs, worked as midwives, nurses, or laundresses. Widows and single women often ran inns or took in boarders. In towns and cities, some women became successful merchants or artisans, though always within the constraints of guild rules and male oversight. They lived under constant supervision by their families, their communities, the church. Gossip was a tool of control. A woman too loud, too visible, too independent could find herself labeled a scold, a shrew, or worse. Her morality was measured not just in her actions, but in how well she conformed to expectations. And yet, in this demanding routine, there was pride, a well-ordered home, a child raised with care, a loaf of bread baked just right. These were accomplishments, even if unrecorded. Women's work, so often invisible, was the foundation upon which medieval society stood. They found meaning in ritual, in relationships, in resilience. Their lives were not easy, but they were deeply connected to nature, to faith, to family. Each task was a thread in the fabric of a life that, while modest, was essential. So as you rest tonight, picture her, kneeling by the hearth, hands dusted with flour, hair damp with effort, eyes soft with fatigue. She is not a queen or saint, not etched in stained glass or written into song, but she held up her world quietly and completely. In our next chapter, we'll explore the other side of this labor, the ways in which women were controlled, punished, and silenced. From public shaming to domestic violence, we will look at the darker shadows that hung over even the brightest days. Until then, sleep soundly, knowing that even the quietest work can echo across time. In medieval Europe, the life of a woman was tightly controlled by the structures of patriarchy and religion. Her body, voice, and movements were subject to scrutiny, not only by her family, but by her neighbors, her church, and the very laws that governed her world. And when she was perceived to step outside those bounds, the consequences could be swift, brutal, and deeply humiliating. Abuse was not hidden. It was structured, legal, and often public. Domestic violence was not just common, it was expected. A husband was considered the rightful authority over his household, and that authority extended to disciplining his wife as he saw fit. Church law, civil codes, and community custom all reinforced this belief. a popular legal principle across much of medieval Europe, allowed a man to chastise his wife so long as he did not maim or kill her. What constituted acceptable chastisement? That depended on the region, the social class, and the whims of the men involved. A beating with a rod was not only tolerated, but in some cases explicitly permitted. The message was clear. A woman was her husband's property, and his discipline, however harsh, was his right. For many women, physical abuse was part of married life. A slap for speaking out of turn, a blow for failing to cook a meal properly, a shove for disagreeing. And because a woman's fate was so deeply tied to her husband's favor, economically, socially, even spiritually, she had few places to turn. There were no police, no shelters, no social workers. The parish priest might offer prayer or counsel, but rarely intervention. If she fled, she risked poverty, shame, and being labeled disobedient, or worse. Public punishment for women extended beyond the home. Adultery, gossip, scolding, or even perceived immodesty could bring severe penalties. One of the most infamous was the scold's bridle, a metal cage locked over a woman's head, with a plate pressing down on her tongue to prevent speech. Women accused of nagging or talking too much could be paraded through town in this contraption, humiliated before their neighbors. Other punishments included ducking stools, wooden seats into which women were strapped and then dunked into rivers or ponds. The intent was not just correction, but spectacle. Crowds gathered to jeer, laugh, and throw refuse. The woman's body became a lesson for others. Stay silent, stay obedient, or suffer. In some towns, adulterous women were whipped through the streets, stripped to the waist, or locked in public stocks. These punishments were reserved almost exclusively for women. A man caught in adultery might face a fine. A woman faced lasting disgrace and sometimes death. The control of women was not limited to their speech or sexuality. It extended to their very presence in society. Unmarried women, widows, or women who lived alone were viewed with suspicion. They were seen as dangerous, disruptive to the social order. A woman without a man was, in the eyes of many, a threat, and so surveillance crept into every corner. Neighbors reported on each other. Gossip carried weight. A single accusation could ruin a woman's life. This atmosphere of fear and control was not accidental. It was designed to keep women compliant, afraid, and dependent. Even religion, which offered solace and meaning to many, was often weaponized. Biblical teachings emphasized female submission. Eve's sin was used to justify female inferiority. Women were taught to be meek, modest, and silent. They were warned that their beauty could lead men astray, that their voices could tempt, that their curiosity could damn. Priests preached sermons on the virtues of obedient wives and the dangers of lustful women. Female saints were revered for their virginity, their martyrdom, or their complete renunciation of the world. The ideal woman was silent, suffering, and self-denying, and yet real women had to live. They had bodies that ached, mouths that wanted to speak, hearts that longed to be free. And when those desires clashed with the rules of their time, they suffered for it. Sexual violence was widespread and rarely punished. The concept of consent was virtually non-existent. A woman's word meant little in court, especially if she was poor or unmarried. Rape victims might be blamed, shamed, or forced to marry their attacker to preserve family honor. Justice, such as it was, belonged to men. One of the darkest manifestations of this misogyny was the witch hunt, beginning in the late medieval period and growing into the early modern era. Thousands of women were accused of witchcraft, often for no more than being old, outspoken, or skilled in herbal medicine. They were tortured until they confessed. Their bodies were examined for the devil's mark, a mole, a scar, a birthmark. They were burned, drowned, or hanged in public executions that both punished and entertained. Behind every accusation was fear, not of magic, but of female power. A midwife who helped too many women survive childbirth. A widow who refused to remarry. A woman who spoke her mind. These were the witches, not because they wielded spells, but because they dared to exist outside the rules. Despite this, women resisted. They formed bonds with one another. They whispered warnings, shared remedies, hid one another from harm. They passed down knowledge in secret through lullabies, recipes, and rituals. They endured not because they were allowed to, but because they refused to disappear. So tonight, as we rest in the safety of a quieter world, let us remember those who did not have that luxury, women whose lives were measured not in joy or achievement, but in how well they conformed to impossible standards. In the next episode, we will explore the rare yet remarkable ways in which women pushed back, not only in secret, but in public, through intellect, creativity, and quiet defiance. They carved out spaces of autonomy in a world built to contain them. Until then, may your dreams be free of cages and bridles. May your voice carry and your story be heard. Sex, for medieval women, was not a private act. It was a matter of morality, politics, theology, and community regulation. A woman's body was never fully her own, and her sexuality, real or perceived, was always subject to judgment. Society did not merely observe her, it disciplined her, and when she strayed, or was thought to stray, punishment often followed. Swift and public, the rules were simple but punishing. Chastity before marriage, fidelity within it, and modesty always. A woman's virtue was her currency. It determined her marriage prospects, her family's honor, her standing in the community. The mere rumor of impropriety could brand her for life, and unlike men, women carried the visible consequences of sex, pregnancy, and with it, the full weight of moral scrutiny. Unwed mothers faced particular cruelty. A woman who gave birth outside marriage might be shunned, fined, or publicly whipped. Her child labeled a bastard, denied inheritance, sometimes baptism. In some regions, these women were forced to wear special clothing or sit in designated pews at church. Her sin, it was believed, stained not only her soul, but her very body. Sex workers occupied a paradoxical position. Prostitution was officially condemned by the church, yet tolerated by secular authorities as a necessary evil. Brothels were regulated, taxed, even advertised in some towns. Women who worked in them were seen as morally inferior, but practically useful as a safeguard against the corruption of honest women. These women lived in legal limbo, protected from certain forms of violence by guilds or brothel owners, yet subject to brutal regulation. They might be confined to specific districts, banned from wearing particular fabrics, denied burial in consecrated ground. If a sex worker became pregnant, she risked losing her livelihood and her home. If she became sick, she was often left to die. And still, many turned to this work, not out of moral failure, but necessity. Widows, abandoned wives, impoverished daughters. For some, it was the only available means of survival. For others, a temporary escape from the tyranny of a bad marriage or household servitude. Their lives, though maligned, were marked by complex networks of care, survival, and dignity against the odds. Public shame was the sharpest tool society wielded. A woman who violated social norms might be paraded through town with a sign of her crime: adultery, lewdness, gossiping. She might have her hair shaved, her clothes ripped, her body exposed. These rituals were not about justice, but deterrence. They transformed women into warnings. Clothing was a battlefield. A woman dressed too finely was vain, too poorly, neglectful, too colorfully, immodest. Sumptuary laws restricted what women could wear based on their class and marital status. A merchant's wife in silk, scandalous. A widow in bright red, suspicious. Each hemline and hue became a statement and a potential transgression. Religious institutions reinforced these codes. Confession manuals instructed priests to interrogate women on their sexual history, thoughts, and temptations. Penances were often gendered, harsher for women, particularly those who admitted to carnal sins. A man's indiscretions might be shrugged off, a woman's immortalized in sermons. Female saints were upheld as examples of chastity and self-denial. Their stories celebrated virginity, suffering, and martyrdom. Saint Agnes, who chose death over marriage. Saint Cecilia, who remained untouched despite wedlock. These ideals left little room for real, flawed, feeling women. They became impossible standards, silently haunting every woman who simply wanted to live. Adultery laws favored men. A husband could kill a cheating wife with impunity in some regions. A wife, by contrast, had no legal grounds to accuse her husband unless it brought dishonor to the family name. In aristocratic circles, affairs by men were accepted, even romanticized. For women, they spelled ruin. This double standard extended to all aspects of life. A man's conquest was a mark of masculinity, a woman's desire a mark of disgrace. Virginity was fetishized, yet knowledge of sex condemned. A woman was expected to be pure, but ready, ignorant, but fertile. The greatest irony, many of the same institutions that policed women's sexuality also exploited it. Lords exercised rights over their female serfs. Clergy seduced penitents. Wealthy men preyed upon servants. And when these women cried out, they were rarely believed. Their virtue was already in question. So who would listen? But some women defied the script. They used sex strategically to gain favor, escape poverty, or assert agency. Courtesans in cities like Venice or Avignon wielded influence through beauty and intellect. Some even hosted salons, exchanged letters with scholars, and left behind poetry and diaries. Others resisted in quieter ways. They refused unwanted marriages, fled abusive husbands, sought refuge in convents. They formed communities with other women, supported each other through hardship, shared herbs and advice to control fertility. In the shadows of judgment, they carved out slivers of autonomy. To understand medieval morality is to see the deep, fierce society held toward female power. Women could give life, stir desire, challenge hierarchy. So, rules were built, not to protect them, but to contain them. And yet, they endured. They lived, loved, laughed, and sometimes even triumphed. Not in grand histories, but in moments. A hand held in secret, a song whispered at night, a decision made in silence that changed a life. So tonight, as we turn off the noise of the present, let us hold space for these women, not just the saints or the sinners, but all those who bore the heavy weight of expectation and still found ways to be human. In our next episode, we'll step into the cloisters and cells where some women found refuge, not from life, but from its demands. Mystics, nuns, anchoresses, women who turned inward, not in retreat, but in radical redefinition. Until then, sleep gently and dream of a world where worth is not measured in silence or shame, in a world that so often silenced, confined, or punished women. Religion offered both a prison and a paradoxical path to liberation. Within the cold stone walls of convents, cloisters, and anchorite cells, women found not only seclusion, but space. Space to think, to write, to feel. While the church reinforced their inferiority in doctrine, it sometimes inadvertently provided the only realm where their intellect, voice, and agency could bloom. To understand this, we must begin with the monastery. In medieval Europe, the convent was one of the few institutions where a woman could live outside of male authority, at least to a degree. A nun's life was bound by rules. Yes, the rule of Saint Benedict, the expectations of chastity, poverty, obedience, but it also promised stability, purpose, and education. For some women, especially those from noble families, the cloister was not a punishment, but a privilege. Young girls were often placed in convents from an early age. Some were truly called to religious life. Others were offered or forced by their families as a way to manage dowries or reduce financial burdens. Within the convent, a girl could learn to read and write Latin, study scripture, practice music, and copy manuscripts. She might be cloistered from the world, but her mind was anything but closed. Abbesses, the leaders of these religious communities, could wield considerable power. They managed land, oversaw finances, directed construction, and corresponded with kings and bishops. Some, like Hildegard of Bingen, became mystics, composers, and philosophers, authors of visions and texts that still echo through time. Hildegard stands as a shining example of religious resistance. A German Benedictine abbess in the 12th century, she experienced intense visions from a young age. Rather than hide them, she recorded them, illustrated them, preached on them. She wrote theological treatises, composed music, studied the natural world. Her correspondence stretched across Europe. She was a woman, not only of the church, but of the world, unafraid to criticize corrupt clergy, advocate for reform, and assert the divine legitimacy of her voice. She was not alone. Women like Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena became spiritual authorities, not because they were ordained, but because their visions and wisdom demanded to be heard. Julian, an anchoress, living in seclusion in a small cell attached to a church, wrote one of the earliest books in English by a woman, Revelations of Divine Love. Her theology emphasized divine compassion, the motherhood of God, and the ultimate goodness of creation. Radical ideas in a world so consumed by fear and punishment. Catherine of Siena, despite never taking full monastic vows, wielded extraordinary influence. She dictated letters to popes, advised rulers, and played a key role in returning the papacy from Avignon to Rome. Her ascetic life, including severe fasting and self-mortification, won her both reverence and controversy. She became a saint, a doctor of the church, and a symbol of what spiritual authority might look like when it bloomed in feminine form. But not all women who turned to religious life did so in grandeur. Many chose, or were led to, paths of extreme seclusion. Anchoresses, for example, were women who voluntarily enclosed themselves in cells, often bricked into small chambers adjoining churches. Through a tiny window, they received food and participated in Mass. Through another, they offered spiritual counsel to visitors. At first glance, it may seem tragic, a life lived in darkness behind stone. But for some women, this was the only way to escape the expectations of marriage and motherhood. In seclusion, they found freedom from fear. They turned inward, not in despair, but in radical redefinition. Their solitude was not a retreat, but a form of protest. This paradox defined the religious lives of many medieval women. The same church that taught them to submit, to suffer, to remain silent, also gave them the tools of literacy, the rituals of meaning, the space to grow. It was in the margins, between doctrine and devotion, that women carved out room to breathe. Mysticism offered one such margin. Unlike formal theology, mysticism emphasized personal experience of the divine, visions, dreams, ecstatic prayer. These were less easily policed. Women mystics wrote with the authority of revelation. Their words could not be dismissed, even when they challenged the status quo. Still, these women were not always safe. Many were suspected of heresy. Some were condemned. Others were silenced by clerical censure. But their legacy endured, not in stained glass or marble statues, but in ink, in song, in whispered prayer. Their writings, preserved by nuns and scribes, offer windows into lives rich with spiritual imagination. They speak of a God who loved beyond rules, of a faith lived in the body as much as the soul. They offer us not just theology, but testimony. This is what it meant to be a woman, seeking meaning in a world of boundaries. So tonight, let us remember that not all resistance is loud. Some of it is quiet, cloistered, lit by candlelight, Some of it is carved into parchment, sung in chant, whispered behind stone walls, and some of it, against all odds, is still echoing. In our next episode, we'll follow the thread of knowledge passed through female hands, how women became healers, herbalists, and midwives, how they were both needed and feared, and how their wisdom was eventually turned against them in flames. Until then, rest deeply, let your dreams wander among abbey gardens, echo in stone corridors, and listen, listen, for the voices that refused to stay silent. In the medieval world, formal education and institutional power were largely barred to women, but knowledge has always found other routes. Through whispered lessons, worn manuscripts, observation, and practice, women became the quiet custodians of healing. They were the midwives, the herbalists, the bone setters, and the wise women who held the body and spirit together in a time when medicine was as much art as science. Their knowledge was not learned in universities, but in kitchens, fields, gardens, and sickbeds, passed from mother to daughter, shared among neighbors, guarded like sacred inheritance. In a world where licensed physicians were rare and often inaccessible, especially to the poor, women healers were essential. A peasant woman might know how to ease a cough with thyme and honey, how to dress wounds with comfrey and yarrow, how to use willow bark to dull pain. She would gather calendula for inflammation, mugwort for childbirth, rue for protection. Her garden was her apothecary, her hands the instruments of mercy. Midwives held a particularly sacred role. They guided new life into the world, often with nothing but cloth, herbs, and experience. In a time of high infant and maternal mortality, their presence was not just helpful, it was life-saving. Midwives knew the signs of danger, how to turn a breech baby, how to calm a panicked mother, how to anoint and baptize a dying child when a priest was not present. The church both needed and mistrusted them. Midwives were granted authority to perform emergency baptisms, an acknowledgement of their vital role. Yet they were also viewed with suspicion. If a child died, was the midwife negligent, or worse, malicious? If a woman miscarried, was it bad luck or witchcraft? Women who practiced healing walked a narrow path. Too much success, and they were envied. Too much knowledge, and they were feared. They lived under a constant cloud of potential accusation. As the medieval period progressed, especially into the later centuries, these suspicions hardened into persecution. Herbalists were increasingly associated with sorcery. The same plants that healed were thought to poison. The same rituals that soothed were rebranded as spells. As male-dominated universities began to professionalize medicine, women were pushed to the margins. Healing, once a shared cultural practice, became a regulated profession, and one largely reserved for men. Still, women persisted. In towns and villages, they continued to care. They were the first to be called when a child burned with fever, when a woman's labor stalled, when a wound festered. Their treatments were not always successful. No medicine is. But they were often the only option available. Their work was messy, intimate, and constant. They washed the sick. They cleaned up blood and vomit. They sat through nights of groaning, pain, and death. They bore the emotional labor of hope and grief, and through it all, they remembered what worked, what didn't, who survived. Some women left behind medical texts, though many were unsigned or attributed to men. Others are only known through trial records, where their wisdom was twisted into evidence of witchcraft. We learn their names not because they were praised, but because they were punished. Take, for example, the case of Jacoba Felicie, a 14th century French woman who practiced medicine in Paris. She was known for her skill, her care, her low fees, but when university-trained male doctors brought complaints, she was put on trial for practicing without a license. Her patients testified in her defense. It didn't matter. She was forbidden from continuing, or the midwives who found themselves caught in the web of witch hunts. Their very profession, intimate with life and death, made them targets. They were accused of stealing babies, of cursing mothers, of consorting with the devil, and yet they continued to serve. Even as the fires burned, women brought life into the world. In convents, some women documented remedies and treatments. They copied texts like the Trotula, a medieval compendium of women's medicine. They preserved knowledge through war, famine, and plague. Their ink-stained hands and careful eyes kept ancient wisdom alive. Healing, for these women, was never just about the body. It was spiritual, communal, emotional. It was about easing pain in a world full of it. It was about giving comfort when there was little else to offer. It was about standing at the threshold of life and death, again and again, with courage. And still today, many of their remedies endure. Lavender for sleep, peppermint for nausea, garlic for infection, honey for wounds. They knew, they taught, they healed. So tonight, let us honor them, not as witches or criminals, not as shadows behind history, but as the front line of medieval care, the women who bent over cradles and deathbeds alike, who asked no glory, only the chance to help. In our next chapter, we will explore the experience of aging in a world that prized youth and fertility. What became of women who outlived childbearing, whose usefulness to society had seemingly ended? Were they feared, revered, or forgotten? Until then, rest softly, and may your dreams be cradled by the gentle hands of those who once held the world together, one remedy at a time. In the medieval world, a woman's value was often measured by her youth, her fertility, and her obedience. So, what happened when those things faded? What became of women who aged, whose wombs fell silent, whose husbands died, whose hair turned gray? Their lives did not end, but in many ways, they moved into a new and uncertain chapter, one of invisibility, vulnerability, and for some, unexpected freedom. To grow old as a woman in the Middle Ages was to navigate a narrowing world. With age came physical hardship, joint pain, failing eyesight, the lingering aches of a body long bent by labor and childbirth. But the social shift was even more profound. A woman past childbearing age no longer fulfilled the role society had most clearly defined for her. She became, in the eyes of many, Surplus. Widowhood was a common fate. The average life expectancy was low, but men often died in battle, in accidents, or simply earlier than their wives due to labor, exposure, or disease. Many women found themselves alone in their 40s, 30s, even 20s. Some had buried more than one husband. Others outlived their entire families. For noble women, widowhood brought legal complexity. Some gained control over property, especially if there were no adult sons. These women could manage estates, oversee finances, and act as heads of households. They might even remarry, though always with consideration to alliances and dowries. A rich widow was a political asset, and often a target. But for most women, widowhood meant economic precarity. If a woman had no land, no trade, no sons to support her, she could fall into poverty quickly. She might move in with married children, seek charity from the church, or enter a convent. Some became beguines, members of semi-religious lay communities that offered support and purpose without requiring lifelong vows. In towns and villages, older women were often respected, but also feared. The line between wisdom and witchcraft was perilously thin. A woman who lived alone, who knew herbs, who spoke her mind, who refused to disappear. These traits could inspire admiration or suspicion, and as witch hysteria grew in later medieval centuries, it was often these older, isolated women who became scapegoats. Their independence became their danger. And yet, aging also offered a strange kind of liberation, freed from the dangers of childbirth, from the gaze of suitors, from the burdens of motherhood. Some women embraced a quieter, more contemplative life. They gathered in spinning circles, tended small gardens, told stories to grandchildren. They became the keepers of memory, the bearers of songs and superstitions. Their homes were humble, but full of meaning. A wooden rosary worn smooth with prayer, a linen chest filled with stitched cloth, a shelf of dried herbs, a cat by the hearth. They were not saints nor witches. They were simply women who had survived. Some were known for their wisdom. Villagers came to them for advice, for healing, for help with births or burials. They knew how to read signs in weather, in plants, in dreams. They were the last to remember the old ways, the ancient songs, the prayers whispered in times of plague, the meanings behind feast days and funerals. Others struggled, isolation, hunger, cold, the slow erosion of their dignity. A world that once depended on them now looked away. In the harshest winters, many old women died unseen. No feast was held for them. No name was etched in stone. The church taught that aging brought one closer to God, that the body's decay was the soul's opportunity for growth. And yet, aged women were rarely offered positions of spiritual authority. They were expected to become silent, penitent, invisible. Some resisted. They wrote letters. They offered counsel. They shaped younger minds. And sometimes they simply existed stubbornly. They woke each morning. They tended to what was theirs. They watched the moon rise over fields they could no longer plow. In literature, they were mocked or feared. The crone, the hag, the shrew, rarely the heroine. And yet, they were everywhere, at every hearth, in every village, behind every child who knew the right herbs to chew when sick. So tonight, let us honor the old women of history, not just the queens who ruled in widowhood, but the quiet ones who endured, the ones who buried lovers and children and still got up the next day, who kept the fire lit, who remembered the names of the dead, who spoke less but knew more. In our final chapter, we will reflect on the legacy of these lives, how women shaped the medieval world, not through power or fame, but through presence, through breath and bread and boundless resilience. Until then, sleep softly, and if you dream, let it be of hands that once wove the world, one stitch at a time, as we draw the final curtain on this journey through the lives of medieval women. Let us take one last quiet moment together, a moment not to mourn, but to recognize, not to judge the past, but to witness it, to let the silence of forgotten lives echo just a little longer in the chambers of our own. History is often written in names and wars, in battles and borders, in kings and crusades. But beneath that loud and masculine chronicle lies another story, a story woven in whispers, in calloused hands, in lullabies and lentil stew, in labor and loss and laughter. It is the story of women, of mothers and daughters, of nuns and heretics, of queens and peasants, of women who never asked for greatness, but gave the world its continuity. They were not the ones crowned, but the ones who crowned kings, not the ones praised in ballads, but the ones who taught those ballads to children, not the architects of cathedrals, but the ones who spun the wool to warm the hands that built them. Their legacy is not in monuments, but in motion, in survival, in care, through every stage of life, from the silenced girlhood to the weight of motherhood, from the terror of punishment to the solace of the convent, from the tireless days of labor to the long twilight of widowhood. Medieval women carried the burden and beauty of being human in a world that often refused to see them as fully so. They adapted, endured, created. They remembered for each other when no one else would. They passed down secrets, faith, bread, and strength. And though they lived in the shadows of official history, they shaped everything we now stand upon. This is not just their story, it is ours, because even now echoes of their lives linger in our languages, our recipes, our rituals, and our resilience. When we speak of strength, we speak with their breath. When we seek justice, we walk their path. So tonight, as the fire dims and the stars take their posts in the night sky, remember them, not as victims, but as witnesses, as makers, as souls who, despite everything, lived lives of deep meaning. They remind us that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, it rocks a cradle, it stirs a pot, it holds a hand, it survives. If this journey touched you, if it stirred something quiet and real inside you, I invite you to leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is, or simply how you're feeling right now. And if you'd like to keep exploring the soft corners of history, consider subscribing. Like the video. Share it with someone who might need a gentle story to sleep by. Your support keeps this space alive, a space where we honor the forgotten, not with noise, but with presence. Thank you for walking with me. Now, rest. You are safe. You are remembered. And you are part of a long, unbroken line of people who care deeply about the quiet truths of our world. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with candlelight, quiet strength, and the warm hands of those who came before you.